Well, let's get into our first round of conversation on some of your biggest stories in the land today. The National Assembly returned to work after weeks of recess due to the coronavirus disease. At a plenary yesterday, the Senate gave an accelerated approval to President Buhari's request to raise a fresh loan of 850 billion naira from the domestic capital market to finance projects in the 2020 budget, asking its committees on finance and appropriation to liaise with the finance minister to get more details on the loan request. Tonight, let's get a sense of what this means for Nigeria, how they came about, and the governance issues in the country. A new spokesperson has been announced also at the Senate, and he joins us from our Abuja studios. Is Dr. Ajibola Basiru, is now the Senate spokesperson. Thank you so much, Dr. Basiru, for joining us tonight on the program. Let's begin by getting your take on what has informed the decision of the Senate to adjourn indefinitely. That means you are not going to be sitting any time soon. And how do you think that will pan out considering governance issues?
Thank you, Sheung. When we say that the Senate is adjourned indefinitely, it could as well mean that the Senate may resume again tomorrow. Indefinite means no specific date has been fixed. It does not mean for eternity or forever for a longer period of time. And as you will know, the Senate had to reconvene yesterday because there were certain important issues to be addressed. So the adjournment, sine die, to use Italian word, does not mean that we will not be able to address governance issues. As you know, there's a leadership to the National Assembly under the chairmanship of Dr. Ahmed Lawal, the Senate president. There will be discussions at the level of leadership as to when necessary approval in plenary is required. So the fact that the Senate is not sitting in plenary does not mean that the Senate is not working or the House of Reps is not working. As of yesterday, 3 p.m., there was a meeting between the Senate Committee on Finance Appropriation, Foreign and Local Loans, and National Planning to discuss with the Honorable Minister for Finance on the rearrangement that have been made to the financing. And you will also know that the Senate is presently expecting the report of the Economic Stimuli Committee set up by Mr. President and which is headed by the Vice President, Professor Yemi Osinbajo, Senior Advocate of Nigeria. So backdoor, without having to sit in plenary, the National Assembly is working, particularly at this very perilous period, with the executive and other arms of government to ensure that governance is not at the back seat. And I must say that it's very important to make a very important clarification, particularly the intro of saying that the Senate approved a fresh loan of 850 billion naira. That is far from the truth. What happened yesterday was a rearrangement as to the source of the initial loan that had been approved to be part of what should be used to fund the 2020 appropriation budget. You will recall that the Senate had actually approved that 850 billion, but to be sourced from external sources, then another 750 billion to be sourced by internal sources. But as it were, because of the COVID-19 pandemic in Nigeria, and of course, because of also the challenge in the international oil market, it is thought fit that it will be pretty difficult and the terms may not be favorable if we still go ahead and take the 850 billion loan already approved in the international market. So what Mr. President requested and sent to the Senate yesterday that was read on the floor was a request as to the source of the 850 billion loan already approved by the National Assembly as part of what will be used to finance the 2020 appropriation. So rather than saying that the National Assembly approved a fresh 850 billion, it is actually an amendment of the initial approval as to the source of that 850 billion. So rather than taking a very tenuous and a cumbersome term, which will be available at the international market because of the change in the circumstance due to those enumerated situation, the approval is that 850 billion already approved can be sourced from the domestic capital market.
Senator, can you tell us, based on what was presented to you, because we understand that there have been some adjustments in the budget considering the effect of the drop in the price of oil, crude oil. How much is then the total debt burden as captured in the 2020 budget, which has been readjusted now?
The readjusted budget is not yet before the National Assembly. It is still being worked upon, and when work on it is completed at the level of executive and bilateral discussion between the executive and the legislature, I believe it will be presented. So as it were now, there are discussions ongoing on adjustment of the budget. The work is not yet complete, so I'm not in a position to tell you what will be the readjusted budget in terms of revenue and on terms of expenditure. But what has been done, what was done yesterday, specifically, the letter of Mr. President was very clear. It's not a request for a fresh loan, but a request that the earlier approved loan of 850 billion, which initially the approval is for it to be sourced externally, is now to be sourced through local capital market. And there are a lot of advantages in that because of the current challenges in the international financial market.
So, in essence, that explains for some of those who are criticized the Senate for giving it in such a way that it was approved. That explains the reason why you gave it an accelerated passage yesterday, isn't it?
Yes, I will say that even though at the level of our committee yesterday, we issued a bulletin to clarify the issue. So I think the general impression is as if just with a wave of the hand, the Senate approved a request to raise 850 billion loan. You will recall that initially when the Senate approval was given to the external borrowing plan of the federal government, the general borrowing plan, both local and the external one, there was a committee of the Senate, which is intercommittee committee itself, which looked at all the ramifications as to the borrowing plan, the content, and also the purpose for which they will be used for. So this effort took weeks, and all the agencies involved in the borrowing had to come before the relevant committees of the Senate to defend their proposition and to look at necessary documentation. So those work had been done. Simply the request of Mr. President, which of course reasonably was approved, was that the 850 billion already approved, would have gone through all the relevant processes of the Senate, should, in terms of the sourcing, be now from the domestic capital market rather than going into the international market for raising the loan. And the justifications were actually given even in the letter for Mr. President. And Mr. President assured, even in the same letter, that the Honorable Minister for Finance and all relevant agencies or executives, they are available to provide whatever explanations that the Senate may require. And that's a consequence upon that, the Finance Committee of the Senate and other relevant committee were asked to interface with the executive, and that interfacing started by 3 p.m. yesterday. So it's not a case of just approving 850 billion. No, it is to say that the 850 billion already approved can now be sourced from the domestic capital market.
It's commonsensical that one would think about borrowing at this moment because there's a revenue shortage, and world over, the world is entering into recession. So it's understandable that you will need to augment what you have, which is there's a shortage. But as an institution that is saddled with oversight, do you have fears about the burden of debt that we have, especially the rate at which it has grown in the last 5 years? And as the Senate, in his wisdom, learned any lesson for the nation at this critical time?
I think rather than talk about debt as a burden, debt is known actually to be a creative way of financing in every sector, both private sector and also the public sector. And it's a recognized mode of financing projects timelessly, so that in the long run, the nation can take the benefit of that lending. So rather than to even talk about debt burden itself, already give a connotation as if raising finance by way of debt has something negative to it. Rather, there's nothing negative about it. The critical issues that the Nigerian Senate looked into is what are the projects for which this debt financing is to be used for. And specifically, when you look at the hearing at the Senate and also the relevant document provided by the executive, each of the components of the borrowing is tied to particularly strategic project that would have a long-term effect positively in our national economy. And of course, you know that there is time value of money. If the country is to expected to get revenue to be able to finance all these important strategic national economic projects by way of direct funding from what is raised in terms of the direct revenue, then I think we may just sign off that there will not be progress in this country. All nations of the world that are developed, they have developed on the basis of creatively borrowing and creatively using those money. So the issue should be, how do we ensure transparency and that the National Assembly exercising its oversight function to ensure that the borrowings and the expenditure is tailored towards what is strategic, what will bring long-term development to our society, and ensure that there is no corruption in the application of those loans. There's nothing inherently wrong in raising financing by way of debt. In fact, it may be positive in the sense that it would allow the nation to have critical needed infrastructure to galvanize, motivate its economy, and ensure that there is overall human development of our people. So the idea of debt burden, I wouldn't see it. I would rather see it from the perspective that it is necessary at this critical point in time to work on certain critical aspects of our infrastructural development with a view to preparing for the population explosion that is expected in our country, and to ensure that the future generation of Nigerians have necessary infrastructure to be able to match up with their colleague or world over.
So, Senator, perhaps a very good place to anchor on this matter will be to ask you that as a nation world over to tighten their belt, of course, Nigeria, we have a problem of revenue, and there's a shortage in the money that comes into the pocket of government to spend for governance sake. And there's been accusation and allegations of the fact that there is just too much money that goes into running government in Nigeria. Is the Senate also looking, especially when it comes to the fact that people have debated how much is being spent to keep and cater for our lawmakers, that Nigerian lawmakers are the highest earners lawmakers around the globe. Is the National Assembly and the Senate thinking of cutting costs?
I think the question about cost of governance should not be looked from a very narrow perspective of making banal allegations against the National Assembly. The question which people who look at it from that prism, which they have not answered, is that what is even the quantum of the nation's budget appropriation in relation to personnel and expenditure that goes to the National Assembly. The truth is that I will agree with you as a patriot that there's a need to cut the cost of governance in Nigeria. But cutting the cost of governance has nothing to do absolutely, and it would be wrong to say that the area you are looking at in cutting cost of governance is in the area of the National Assembly allocation. I challenge all the pundits to come up and say that, assuming today the National Assembly is even scrapped and no amount of money is allocated to the National Assembly and we don't have a legislative arm again, how much would that save for the country? And some of the arguments also beg the important question of the fact that the National Assembly is actually the bulwark of democratic governance in Nigeria and indeed in any Army society. It's an essential arm of government, but unfortunately, because of incursion of military into our politics between 1966 and 1979, 1983, and possibly an interregnum, then 1999 till now, you have seen an understood arm of government. But really, the problem of restructuring goes overboard into looking at the entire government architecture in Nigeria.
All right.
Today, we have 36 state government. You have the national, we have the FCT government, you have the federal government. If you are talking about cutting the cost of governance, I would rather be talking about how do we look at regionalism? Do we look at possibly reducing the legislative arm? Do we look at even looking at the
Senator,
and the MDA, assess their efficiency, assess their utility? So it is a more broader item than to just throw political sloganeering against
I guess it's a good place to
it's a
anchor,
more deeper
Senator.
issue to address the issue of overall restructuring of our structure of governance, rather than make it as a kind of a sloganeering to attack possibly the developing aspect of our democratic governance, which is the National Assembly.
Senator Ajibola Basiru, the Senate spokesperson, thank you so much for joining us tonight and talking about these issues. We'll take a break, everyone. And when we return, we'll be speaking with the Minister of Finance on the handling of the Nigerian economy, the borrowings, and the way forward at a critical time in our national life.